parents got me drum lessons. Get a pair of sticks and a practice pad and lessons. I'd spread magazines around my bed, and it would be Keith Moon's drums.
He was a genius drummer of one of the greatest progressive rock bands in the world. The lyricist behind songs like 2112, Tom Sawyer, and The Spirit of Radio, written with razor-sharp intellect and mathematical precision. But if you think Neil Peart was just a technical musician behind an enormous drum kit, you're missing a personal story more haunting than any of his legendary solos. He was once a failed teenager returning from London, a father who lost his only daughter in a car accident, a husband who lost his wife less than a year later, and chose to ride 88,000 kilometers on a motorcycle just to learn how to stay alive. This is a journey of Neil Peart, not just a professor behind the drums, but a man who loved deeply, grieved deeply, and ultimately chose silence over spotlight. A life that was never fully told. Until now. Early life. Neil Elwood Peart was born on September 12, 1952 in Hamilton, Ontario, a gritty industrial city in southern Canada. His parents, Glenn and Betty Peart, were hard-working people who lived by a classic conservative middle-class mindset. Work hard, keep quiet, don't complain. Neil was the eldest of 4 siblings, followed by Danny, Judy, and Nancy. And from an early age, it was clear he wasn't like anyone else in the family. In 1954, when Neil was 2, the family moved to St. Catharines, a quiet rural town with dusty roads and winters that lasted longer than expected. They settled near Port Dalhousie, a lakeside area marked by old churches, aging docks, and thick morning fog. Neil grew up in a conservative society where silence was seen as a virtue, and he fit in perfectly in his own way. Quiet, introspective, always observing from the sidelines. Instead of making friends, Neil befriended books and sound. He spent hours listening to the radio on an old set, jotting down song structures, and memorizing melodies in his head like a silent decoder. At his mother's urging, he tried piano lessons, but felt no passion for it. The only thing that truly excited Neil was noise, his fingers tapping rhythms on the table, the clatter of household objects. He drummed on everything, his mother later recalled. The table, the chairs, even the windows. This wasn't mischief. It was the only way Neil knew how to express emotion. At age 14, realizing their son couldn't resist the rhythms constantly playing his head, Neil's parents bought him a small Stewart drum kit from a local music shop for his birthday. It was an expensive gift, but it was the beginning of everything. Neil barely left the drum set for months. He practiced obsessively in the basement, repeating rudiments like a meditating monk. He was enrolled in Peninsula Conservatory of Music, where he studied under Don George, a strict, serious teacher who recognized something unusual in Neil, a mind that functioned like a machine, but with a heart full of patience and a will far beyond his years. Neil's first public performance wasn't in a club or lounge, but in the hall of St. John's Anglican Church in Port Dalhousie during a Christmas service. He'll remember that moment for the rest of his life, not because of praise, but because for the first time, the sound inside his head could be heard by the world. Neil's teenage years weren't filled with friends. He attended Lakeport Secondary School, which he once described as a factory for training social conformity, something he never quite adapted to. To his classmates, he was a kid on the sidelines, quiet, non-athletic, but always present at band rehearsals. He played in several school bands, including the Eternal Triangle, Junior Flood, and the Majority. In one school performance, he played an original song titled LSD Forever, not because he used drugs, but because he wanted to tap into the rhythm of the times, even if he didn't fit it. Outside school, Neil lived like a typical Canadian teenager, working part-time at carnivals, manning balloon stands, or shooting games. But he got fired for not smiling at customers. What no one understood was that he wasn't being rude. He simply found faking emotions unbearable. Around this time, he began to nurture a vague dream, to leave Canada and go to Europe, where rock music was exploding. But what he was truly searching for wasn't the spotlight. He just wanted to be himself, to not be forced to speak, not be forced to smile, just to drum and be silent afterward. Early career. At 18, Neil Peart bought a one-way ticket to London. For a young man from a small town in Ontario, it was a decision no one could quite understand, except Neil himself. While others enrolled in college or took factory jobs, Neil boarded a plane with a few $100s in savings and a modest drum kit, driven by a vague belief that Europe might give him a foothold in music. In the 1970s, London was the epicenter of the rock world. But for Neil, it wasn't a dream. It was a cold, indifferent reality. He didn't stand out among thousands of drummers who were better, bolder, more rebellious, and better connected. He played with nameless bands, landed a few anonymous session gigs, and worked part-time at the Great Frog, a legendary rock jewelry store on Carnaby Street, frequented by hippies and glam rockers of the era. Life was tough and lonely, but Neil didn't complain. Instead, he read voraciously, as if words were the only nourishment keeping him alive. He immersed himself in the works of Ayn Rand, especially the novella Anthem, with its fierce individualism and defiance of collective. That influence would later seep into the lyrics he wrote for Rush, particularly on albums like Fly By Night and 2112. After nearly 2 years of living in disappointment and invisibility, Neil realized he didn't belong in London. Not yet, at least. No band had signed him. No door had opened. He returned to Canada, not as a failure, but as someone who understood he had to start from the roots. Back in St. Catharines, he worked for Dalziel Equipment, where his father, Glenn Peart, was the branch manager. The job had nothing to do with music, selling industrial machinery, offering technical advice, making deliveries, but he gave it everything he had. Neil once said, "I don't wait for opportunity. I prepare for it, even if it never comes." In his spare time, he drummed with a local band called Hush, a low-profile group, but enough to keep his skills sharp. One evening in late July 1974, Neil learned that a Toronto band named Rush was looking for a new drummer to replace John Rutsey, who had stepped down due to health reasons. They were about to embark on their first U.S. tour and urgently needed someone who could play, tour, and survive the pressure. Neil loaded his drum kit into his car and drove over 100 kilometers to the audition. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, Rush's remaining members, didn't know what to expect. They'd only heard Neil was solid and read a lot of books. But when he sat behind the drums, everything changed within the first few beats. His technique far exceeded their expectations. But what truly convinced them wasn't just his speed or precision. It was his calm, introspective presence, like someone who had been drumming in his mind his whole life and had only now let it out. Neil Peart officially joined Rush on July 29, 1974. 2 weeks later, he stepped onto his first major stage, Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, opening for Uriah Heep and Man for Man before an audience of over 11,000 people. Not a single person in that crowd knew that the drummer behind that massive kit had just failed in London, sold souvenirs on the street, and once got fired from a carnival job for not smiling. It was the beginning not of a rock star, but of something entirely new. A drummer who didn't crave the spotlight, who didn't chase fame, who didn't like meeting fans, but who wrote lyrics more profound than most singers. Neil Peart, who wouldn't just play drums for Rush, but would come to define the band's very soul. Career success. On August 14, 1974, Neil Peart stepped onto the stage at Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, opening for Uriah Heep and Man for Man before more than 11,000 people. He had joined Rush just 2 weeks earlier. The band was embarking on its first major tour. But what set Neil apart wasn't his drumming. It was how he watched the crowd from behind his kit, as if he were measuring life in rhythms rather than lights. Shortly after, Rush entered the studio to record their first album with Neil, Fly By Night, 1975. There he did something unprecedented. He wrote all the lyrics as the drummer. Influenced by Ayn Rand and existentialist philosophy, Neil quietly initiated a transformation. From a Led Zeppelin-tinged hard rock band, Rush evolved into something else. Less predictable, longer, more complex, and no longer tailored for mass appeal. This experiment reached its extreme with Caress of Steel, 1975, an album steeped in fantasy, layered structures, and lyrics like a bleak epic. Critics hated it. Sales flopped. The label demanded they simplify. But instead, Neil wrote 2112, a 20-minute act of defiance about a dystopian society where music is banned and individuality crushed. Released in 1976, 2112 shocked the industry, but in the opposite way. It not only saved Rush from being dropped, it catapulted them onto the global rock map, marking the beginning of a golden era for a Canadian band no one had expected. For Neil Peart, every album was not just a collection of songs, but a chapter in his personal philosophical journey. In A Farewell to Kings, 1977, he wrote about the disillusionment with power and idealism. In Hemispheres, 1978, he constructed an imaginary universe of logic versus emotion. Then in 1980, with Permanent Waves, Neil shattered the illusions he had helped create, turning away from myth toward reality, where ordinary people wrestle with a complex world. It was a turning point. And Moving Pictures, 1981, was the peak. Tom Sawyer, with its intricate drumming and near nonlinear structure, became Rush's biggest hit. But to Neil, the most personal track was Limelight, a quiet confession from a reluctant celebrity. He wrote about the discomfort of fame, the loss of privacy, the suffocating act of performing one's own persona. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Neil continued to steer the band into uncharted territory. He brought philosophy into pop, science fiction into ballads, themes of love, loss, humanity, and willpower into arrangements more complex than some novels. Strangely, though, he remained unseen. While the world adored Alex Lifeson's stage swagger or Geddy Lee's explosive synths, Neil stayed hidden behind a fortress of drums, his private sanctuary. No one in Rush was more overlooked by the media than Neil. Yet no one in the drumming world was more revered. Stuart Copeland of the Police once said, "We studied every one of Neil's solos like they were scripture." And Dave Grohl put it simply, "Neil Peart is the reason I bought a drum kit." Neil wasn't just great at playing. He was brilliant at thinking and writing. His solos, like in La Villa Strangiato or YYZ, weren't speed showcases. They were sonic essays. So much so that when invited to perform at the 1992 Buddy Rich Memorial Concert, a jazz, not rock event, he earned a standing ovation from the big band orchestra. Neil documented everything in writing. He authored Ghost Rider, Traveling Music, The Masked Rider, not to chronicle tours, but to map inner journeys no one else could see. He cycled through West Africa, rode a motorcycle across Canada, observed the world like a traveler in his own life. With millions of albums sold, hundreds of sold-out shows, and a fiercely loyal global fan base, Rush might be the greatest band the mainstream never truly understood. And that's exactly what made them special. In 1996, all three Rush members were awarded the Order of Canada, the nation's highest civilian honor. In 2013, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. During the ceremony, Neil Peart didn't speak. He let Geddy and Alex do the talking, then gave a slight bow, a wordless thank you. That was Neil Peart, a man who played drums like writing a thesis, who wrote lyrics like etching a headstone, and who lived as if fame were a regrettable accident. Personal life. Neil Peart was never the kind of artist to walk red carpets with glamorous women, nor the type of rocker surrounded by scandals or fleeting romances. On stage, he drummed like a superhuman machine, but off stage, he lived like an ordinary man, perhaps even too quietly given the spotlight he commanded. In 1975, as Rush was beginning to rise across North America, Neil married Jacqueline Taylor, a woman who was never seen backstage, never photographed in magazines, never accompanying her husband to award shows. But she was always there. She was a place he returned to after every show, the first reader of his early writings, and the mother of his only daughter, Selena Taylor Peart, born in 1978. The Peart family was not flashy but deeply peaceful in industry, where everything moved fast and changed faster. Neil and Jackie lived removed from the entertainment world, first in a modest home in rural Ontario, then in Santa Monica. When not touring, Neil didn't party. He read books, wrote handwritten letters to his wife, and tended the backyard garden with Jackie. For years, they were a rare ideal in rock, a steady marriage, a well-raised child, no rumors, no exposure. And then everything collapsed in less than a year. On August 10th, 1997, Selena, just 19, was killed in a car accident on her way to university. Neil couldn't believe what he heard over the phone. In his memoir, he wrote, "I walked out back, held Jackie, and whispered, 'You don't have to be strong. Let's pretend we're dead, and if possible, find a way to come back to life.' But Jackie never found that way. She passed away less than a year later, from what Neil described as not merely a biological illness, but a broken heart that could not be healed. To the media, Neil Peart vanished. To friends, he was taking a break from touring to regain balance. But the truth was, he rode his motorcycle alone for over 55,000 miles across North and Central America, through remote roads, camping in forests, talking to strangers at gas stations. Not to escape, but to survive. It became the basis of Ghost Rider, the book he wrote not as an artist, but as a man who had lost everything, trying to recover breath by breath. Neil wrote, "Some days I'd ride 12 hours just to keep from thinking. Other days I'd stop mid-road, lay my head on the handlebars, and cry like a child." After that journey, he didn't expect to return to music, nor to love. But in 1999, at a small music event in Los Angeles, Neil met a young photographer named Carrie Nuttall. She wasn't from the rock world. She didn't know much about Rush. But she saw in Neil not a legend, but a man who had once broken. Carrie didn't save Neil. She simply waited quietly, patiently, giving him space to find his own way out of the dark. A year later, they married on September 9th, 2000. And 9 years after that, at age 57, Neil welcomed his second daughter, Olivia Louise Peart. Neil never made a grand comeback. He didn't go on talk shows. But those who followed his journey knew he had learned to begin again, not through music, but by walking his daughter to school each morning, by cooking for his wife, and by learning to live slowly, down at each breath. In his final years, he described himself as a retired drummer and full-time dad. When Geddy Lee asked about touring again, Neil declined, because he didn't want to miss the second childhood of a daughter. Peart once lost everything, but he didn't let that define the rest of his life. And perhaps that's what truly made him different. Rumors and truth behind the spotlight. Neil Peart was never the kind of artist fans could easily approach. He didn't appear backstage after shows. He didn't sign albums after performances. He never organized fan meet and greets. And he never shared personal details with the media. This left many fans, those who had quietly waited by the stage door, feeling confused, even resentful. A rumor spread for years. Neil Peart hated his fans. And like many legends that feel too unusual to be true, that rumor was entirely wrong. But it wasn't entirely right either. The truth was, Neil had mild social anxiety, and more importantly, he refused to pretend to be friendly just to meet expectations. He once wrote candidly in his memoir, "I'm not good at showing emotion to strangers. If my presence disappoints someone, I'd rather withdraw than fake joy." On one stop at a gas station during his long journey after losing his wife and daughter, a fan recognized him and asked for an autograph. Neil politely but firmly declined. The story was quickly posted on a blog, misunderstood, and morphed into an article accusing him of being the coldest artist in rock. Later, Neil addressed the incident with a tone of weary acceptance, not defensiveness. "There are pains that can't be shared in moments when I simply couldn't smile, even if I wanted to." Neil rarely signed autographs in public, not out of arrogance, but because he believed personal space was sacred for both himself and others. To him, a signature meant nothing without sincerity. What he feared most was having to play a role, even the role of the friendly artist. It wasn't just fans who misunderstood him. Music media did too, for decades, especially Rolling Stone, the most influential music magazine of the 70s to 90s. They virtually ignored Rush for 30 years, refused to name Neil in lists of the greatest drummers, and rarely gave positive reviews to the band's albums. The reason was never stated, but everyone knew Neil Peart was too complex, too intellectual, and too far outside mainstream tastes. At a time when the industry favored artists who said things that were simple and digestible, Neil wrote about Greek mythology, the structure of the brain's hemispheres, individual liberty, and the corruption of fame. His lyrics weren't meant to be skimmed. He didn't get angry. He didn't respond. He simply went silent. When he disappeared from music after the tragedies of 1997, with no press release, no public statement, no rumor correction, the media labeled him the invisible rock star. No interviews, no news, no sign of a return. But he was still alive, riding his motorcycle through the deserts of the U.S., the highways of Mexico, the frozen towns of Canada. A journey of over 55,000 miles lasting more than a year, without a manager, bodyguard, or paparazzi. Just him and questions no one could answer. To many, that journey seemed strange. But to Neil, it was survival, not escape, but direct confrontation with grief. When he shared it in Ghostwriter, thousands of readers beyond the rock world began to see a different person. Not a cold icon, but a man who had nothing left to lose, except his belief that someday he might feel normal again. And it was that journey, with no press tour, no media campaign, that became a symbol for thousands of people barely hanging on. Because Neil didn't get back up through stage lights, but through spinning wheels in the desert and questions scribbled when there was no one left to ask. Perhaps that's the real face of a legend. Final years and legacy. When Rush released their final album Clockwork Angels in 2012, Neil Peart was already in his 60s. In the few interviews he gave, he still spoke about music with the same passion he had at the beginning. But behind it all, something was changing. Not the sound, but his body. Rush embarked on their final tour, their 40 tour, in 2015, celebrating 40 years together. On stage, Neil still played like a perfectly programmed machine. But off stage, he limped, leaned on hallway walls, and silently listened while his bandmates spoke to press. He began to realize that precision no longer came from strength, but from a very human limit, endurance. In a letter to fans, Neil wrote candidly, "I don't want to be the best drummer who played himself into exhaustion. I want to be a healthy father. I've had a full career, and I want to leave it at the right time." After that tour, Neil Peart withdrew completely from public life. No farewell shows, no goodbye album, no promises of return. He returned to his home in California, living with his wife Carrie and young daughter Olivia, then just in elementary school. Every morning he took her to school. Every afternoon he read in the garden. A man who once wrote lyrics about time, the cosmos, and the self, now poured his remaining energy into living a simple, unlit life. The world no longer saw him, and had no idea he was fighting an unthinkable battle. In 2016, Neil was diagnosed with glioblastoma, a highly aggressive and nearly untreatable form of brain cancer. The disease progressed quietly but brutally, stealing his memory, balance, speech, and eventually mobility. He chose to keep it entirely private, sharing it only with family and a few close friends. For the last 3 years of his life, Neil Peart did not appear anywhere. He didn't complain. He didn't offer hollow inspiration. He didn't try to be a symbol of strength. He simply lived, genuinely, completely, and quietly. He passed away on January 7th, 2020 in Santa Monica, in the arms of his wife and daughter. No media outlet knew. No Facebook post spread the news. His family remained silent for 3 full days until they could accept that Neil was truly gone. When the news broke on January 10th, fans around the world were stunned into silence. No one knew he was ill. No one got to say goodbye. And no one could replace him. Not just for Rush, but for an entire generation that loved precision, depth, and artists who didn't need the spotlight to be remembered. Neil Peart didn't just leave behind a collection of legendary drum solos. He left behind a standard of artistic integrity, uncompromising, uncommercial, unapologetic. He also left behind a unique body of literature, where a drummer didn't just describe the world in rhythms, but through journeys, grief, and the healing power of observation. He was the reason many people learned to play drums. But he was also the reason many learned how to live. In a world where so many artists must shout to be heard, Neil Peart was the greatest paradox of all, a man who chose silence, yet left behind an echo that will never fade. Neil Peart never tried to become a legend. He didn't step on stage to prove anything, didn't play music to win, didn't write books to make headlines. And perhaps that's exactly why he became one of the most respected artists, not just in rock, but among those who still believe there's a place in this world for quiet strength, unwavering integrity, and kindness. From a child growing up in the cold Canadian winters, to a teenager who failed in London, from the artist who helped Rush rewrite the history of progressive rock, to the father who lost both wife and daughter within a year and didn't collapse, and then to the man who was reborn through a solitary journey, only to choose a quiet life with another child in his arms. Neil Peart played drums with intellect, wrote music with memory, lived by principle, and left this world in dignified silence. If you too believe that music is more than just sound, that it's memory, pain, and the way a person finds himself again in a noisy world, leave a comment for Neil Peart. When was the last time you listened to Limelight? When was the first time you saw yourself in a Rush lyric? Tell us in the comments, because some stories only need a single drum beat to come back to life. And if you want to keep exploring journeys like his, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to join us in the next video.